The rain was coming down hard that Tuesday night as Judge Rebecca Stone drove home from the state legal conference in downtown Springfield. She had spent the last 3 days listening to presentations about court reform and judicial best practices. At 52, she had been on the bench for 15 years and was, well respected throughout the county for her fair but firm approach to justice. Rebecca checked her watch as she merged onto highway, for it was already past 10 in the evening, much later than she had planned to leave. The conference had run long with heated discussions about police accountability measures, a topic that always stirred strong emotions from both sides. As one of only 3 black judges in the district, Rebecca often found herself in the middle of these conversations, trying to bridge the gap between community concerns and law enforcement needs. The luxury sedan hummed quietly along the nearly empty highway. Rebecca had treated herself to the Mercedes 2 years ago after her daughter graduated law school. It was a small celebration of how far she had come from her modest beginnings in the inner city. Her phone buzzed with a text from her husband asking when she would be home. She made a mental note to call him once she reached the next rest stop. 20 miles outside the city limits, the car started making an unusual noise. Rebecca frowned and turned down the radio to listen more carefully. The engine was making a grinding sound that definitely was not normal. She had just taken the car in for service last month, so this was unexpected. The grinding got louder, and suddenly the engine started losing power. Rebecca carefully pulled over to the shoulder of the highway as the car began to sputter. The engine died completely as she came to a stop. She sat there for a moment, listening to the rain pound against the windshield. This stretch of highway was pretty isolated, with mostly farmland on both sides and very little traffic at this time of night. She tried starting the engine again, but it would not turn over. The dashboard lights were still working, so it was not the battery. Rebecca sighed and reached for her purse to get her phone. She would need to call for roadside assistance, and unfortunately, it looked like she would be stuck here for a while. As she was scrolling through her contacts to find the insurance company number, she saw headlights approaching from behind. The vehicle slowed down and pulled over behind her car. Rebecca felt a mix of relief and caution. While she was grateful someone had stopped to help, she was also aware that being a woman alone on a dark highway was not the safest situation. The headlights were positioned high off the ground, suggesting it was a truck or SUV. Through her rearview mirror, she could see additional lights on top of the vehicle. Her heart sank a little when she realized it was a police car. While most people would feel safer seeing law enforcement, Rebecca's experiences as a black woman had taught her to be cautious around police. Even though she worked within the justice system every day, 2 officers got out of the patrol car and walked toward her vehicle. Rebecca rolled down her window about halfway as the first officer approached. He was a tall man in his 30s with a serious expression. His partner, slightly older with graying temples, hung back near the patrol car initially. "Evening, ma'am," the first officer said, shining his flashlight into her car. "Having some car trouble?" "Yes, officer. My engine just died on me," Rebecca replied politely. "I was just about to call for roadside assistance." The officer's flashlight beam moved around the interior of her car, lingering on her purse and briefcase in the passenger seat. "This your vehicle, ma'am?" Rebecca was surprised by the question, but answered calmly, "Yes, it is. I was driving home from a conference in Springfield when it broke down. Can I see your license and registration, please?" This request struck Rebecca as odd, since she had not been driving when they arrived and was clearly having mechanical problems, but she complied. She reached into her purse to get her wallet while the officer kept his flashlight trained on her movements. As she handed over her documents, the second officer approached the passenger side of the car. "Pretty expensive car," he commented, peering through the window. "What kind of work do you do?" "I work in the legal field," Rebecca answered, keeping her response general. She had learned long ago that revealing she was a judge sometimes created awkward situations, and she preferred to keep a low profile when possible. The first officer was examining her license with his flashlight. "Rebecca Stone," he read aloud. "You live pretty far from here. What were you doing in Springfield?" "I was attending a work conference, as I mentioned. It ended late, and I was driving home when my car broke down." The officers exchanged a look that Rebecca did not like. The second officer walked around to the back of her car and started examining it with his flashlight. "The plates match," he called out to his partner. Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. Why were they checking to see if her plates matched her registration? She was clearly the victim of a breakdown, not someone engaged in criminal activity. "Ma'am, would you mind stepping out of the vehicle?" The first officer asked. "Is there a problem, officer? I have not been driving erratically or broken any traffic laws. My car simply broke down. Just routine, ma'am. Please step out of the car." Rebecca's legal training kicked in. She knew she was not required to get out of her car unless they had reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, which clearly they did not. However, she also knew that challenging police officers on the side of a dark highway was not the safest choice for anyone, especially a black woman. "Officer, I understand you are doing your job, but I have not committed any crime. My car broke down, and I would like to simply call for roadside assistance so I can get home to my family." The atmosphere shifted noticeably. Both officers became more rigid in their posture, and the first officer's tone became more authoritative. "Ma'am, I asked you to step out of the vehicle. Are you refusing to comply with a lawful order?" Rebecca felt the familiar frustration that came with these situations. As a judge, she dealt with police officers every day in her courtroom. She knew the law inside and out. She also knew that what they were asking was not actually a lawful order under these circumstances, but she also knew that explaining constitutional law to officers who were clearly looking for a problem was not going to end well. "Officer, I am not refusing anything. I am simply trying to understand why you need me to exit my vehicle when I am the victim of a car breakdown and have committed no traffic violations." The rain continued to beat down around them as the tension in the air grew thicker. Rebecca could see that her calm, rational response was only making the officers more suspicious rather than less. In her years on the bench, she had seen this scenario play out too many times in the cases that came before her court. She took a deep breath and made a decision that she hoped would de-escalate the situation. "Officers, I am happy to cooperate. I just want to get home safely tonight." As Rebecca reached for the door handle, she had no idea that this simple car breakdown was about to change everything. She could not have known that these two officers had cases pending in her courtroom. She could not have predicted that her decision to remain anonymous would lead to one of the most shocking confrontations in the county's legal history. The door opened, and Rebecca stepped out into the cold, rainy night. Unaware that she was about to become the center of a story that would make national headlines, Rebecca stepped out of her car into the cold rain, immediately feeling the water soaking through her professional blazer. The two officers positioned themselves on either side of her, their flashlights creating harsh shadows in the darkness. She could hear the highway patrol radio crackling from their car, but the voices were too distant to make out clearly. "Turn around and place your hands on the vehicle," the first officer, whose nameplate read Officer Davis, commanded. Rebecca felt her heart rate increase. This was completely unnecessary for a simple car breakdown, and she knew it. "Officer Davis, I need you to explain why you are treating me like a criminal suspect. I have provided my identification, and you can clearly see that this is my vehicle." "Ma'am, we have reports of stolen vehicles in this area, and your story does not add up," Officer Davis replied, though Rebecca noticed he could not look her directly in the eyes as he said it. The second officer, whose badge identified him as Officer Mitchell, moved closer. A woman alone in an expensive car on a back highway at night. "You have to admit it looks suspicious." Rebecca felt a familiar anger rising in her chest. She had heard variations of this same logic countless times in her courtroom, usually from officers trying to justify questionable stops and searches. "Officers, what exactly looks suspicious about a woman having car trouble? Would you be asking these same questions if I were a white woman in this same situation?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Officer Davis's jaw tightened. "Do not make this about race, lady. We are just doing our job." "And what job is that exactly? Harassing citizens who have committed no crime?" Officer Mitchell stepped forward aggressively. "You are starting to sound like one of those people who thinks they know the law better than we do." Rebecca almost laughed at the irony, but she kept her expression neutral. "I do know the law, officer. I know that you have no legal grounds to detain me, search me, or treat me as a suspect when I am clearly the victim of a car breakdown." "Oh, you are a lawyer?" Officer Davis asked with obvious sarcasm in his voice. "I work in the legal system." "Yes." Rebecca was careful not to reveal her exact position, hoping that establishing some legal credibility might make them reconsider their approach. Instead, it seemed to make things worse. Officer Mitchell rolled his eyes. "Great. Another legal eagle who thinks she can lecture us about how to do our jobs." The rain was getting heavier, and Rebecca was now thoroughly soaked. Her carefully styled hair was plastered to her head and her expensive suit was ruined. "Officers, can we please just call this what it is? You stopped to help someone with car trouble. You checked my identification. You confirmed that I am the legal owner of this vehicle, and now we should all move on with our night. I will call for roadside assistance and you can continue your patrol." But Officer Davis was not ready to let it go. "I think we need to search this vehicle. Make sure there is nothing illegal inside." Rebecca knew this was the line she could not let them cross. "Officer, you do not have probable cause to search my vehicle. I have committed no crime, I am not under arrest, and I do not consent to any search." "Well, look at that," Officer Mitchell said to his partner. "She is refusing to cooperate with a lawful investigation." "This is not a lawful investigation," Rebecca responded firmly. "This is harassment, and you both know it." The two officers exchanged another look, and Rebecca could see them silently communicating. She had seen this same look pass between officers in her courtroom when they realized their case was falling apart. But instead of backing down, they seemed to double down on their aggressive approach. "Ma'am, you are being argumentative and uncooperative," Officer Davis said. "We are going to need you to turn around and put your hands behind your back." Rebecca could not believe what she was hearing. "You are arresting me? For what crime?" "Obstruction of justice and resisting arrest," Officer Mitchell replied, moving toward her with handcuffs. "I have not resisted anything. I have answered all your questions and provided my identification. You cannot arrest someone for knowing their constitutional rights." But Officer Mitchell was already grabbing her arm roughly. Rebecca instinctively pulled away, not because she was trying to escape, but because his grip was unnecessarily forceful and painful. "There it is," Officer Davis said. "Resisting arrest. Get the zip ties." Rebecca found herself being spun around and pushed face first against her own car. The rain-soaked metal was cold against her cheek as Officer Mitchell forced her arms behind her back. She could feel the plastic zip ties cutting into her wrists as they were tightened far more than necessary. "This is completely illegal," she said, her voice muffled against the car. "You have no grounds for this arrest. Tell it to the judge." Officer Davis replied with a laugh that made Rebecca's blood run cold. If only he knew. She thought to herself, what happened next would be seared into Rebecca's memory forever. As Officer Mitchell attempted to walk her toward the patrol car, she slipped on the wet pavement. Instead of helping her regain her footing, both officers seemed to interpret her stumble as another act of resistance. "She is trying to run," Officer Mitchell shouted, though Rebecca was clearly just trying to stay upright with her hands secured behind her back. Before she knew what was happening, Rebecca felt herself being pushed down into the muddy ditch beside the highway. The cold, dirty water soaked through her clothes as she landed face first in the muck. She tried to roll over to keep from drowning in the shallow water, but the zip ties made it nearly impossible to move properly. "Stop resisting," Officer Davis yelled, though Rebecca was doing nothing but trying to breathe. She felt hands grabbing her arms and dragging her through the mud toward the patrol car. Her knees scraped against rocks and debris in the ditch. Her professional clothes, her dignity, her sense of safety, everything was being stripped away in those horrible minutes. "You are making this harder on yourself," Officer Mitchell said as they pulled her up from the ditch. Rebecca's mouth was full of muddy water, and she was coughing and choking as they dragged her toward their vehicle. Her carefully maintained professional appearance was completely destroyed. Mud covered her from head to toe. Her hair was full of debris and her suit was torn in several places. As they reached the patrol car, Rebecca managed to find her voice again. "This is assault," she gasped. "You will both be held accountable for this." "Yeah, right," Officer Davis replied as he opened the back door of the patrol car. "You think anyone is going to believe a story from someone who got arrested for fighting with police officers?" They shoved her into the back seat, where she sat dripping mud and water onto the vinyl seats. Through the wire mesh separating the front and back seats, she could hear them talking. "Should we call this in?" Officer Mitchell asked. "Already did while you were getting her secured," Officer Davis replied. "Told dispatch we had a suspicious person who became combative during questioning. Standard procedure." Rebecca closed her eyes and tried to control her breathing. In all her years as a judge, she had never imagined she would experience the justice system from this perspective. She thought about all the cases she had heard where defendants claimed police brutality or excessive force. She had always tried to be fair and consider all evidence, But she realized now that she might not have fully understood what some of these people had endured. The irony was not lost on her that these same officers who were now transporting her to jail in zip ties and covered in mud would likely be appearing in her courtroom within the next few weeks. Officer Davis had a DUI case scheduled, and Officer Mitchell was the arresting officer in a domestic violence case. Both cases were on her docket. As they drove toward the county jail, Rebecca made a silent promise to herself. She would not let this injustice stand. She would use every tool at her disposal to ensure that these officers faced consequences for their actions, but she would do it the right way. Through the legal system, she had devoted her life to serving. She had no way of knowing that a passing motorist had witnessed the entire incident and captured it on their dash cam. She had no way of knowing that by tomorrow morning, the whole county would be talking about what had happened to Judge Rebecca Stone, and she certainly had no way of knowing that Officers Davis and Mitchell were about to learn a lesson about justice that they would never forget. The fluorescent lights in the county jail booking area were harsh and unforgiving as Rebecca sat on the hard metal bench, still covered in mud and shivering from her wet clothes. The zip ties had been replaced with proper handcuffs, but they were still uncomfortably tight around her wrists. Every few minutes, an officer or clerk would walk by and stare at her with curiosity, probably wondering how someone who looked like she belonged in a boardroom had ended up in their holding cell. Sergeant Williams, the booking officer, was a heavy-set man in his 50s who had worked at the jail for over 20 years. He approached Rebecca with a clipboard and a bored expression that suggested he had done this thousands of times before. "Name?" he asked without looking up. "Rebecca Stone," she replied, her voice hoarse from the ordeal. Sergeant Williams wrote it down and then paused. He looked up at her face, then back down at the paperwork, then up at her again. There was something in his expression that suggested the name was familiar to him, but he continued with the standard booking questions. Address? Rebecca provided her home address in the upscale Riverside neighborhood. Sergeant Williams raised an eyebrow but wrote it down without comment. Occupation? This was the moment Rebecca had been dreading. She could lie and say she was just an attorney, but that would create problems later when they verified her information. She could remain silent, but that might make things worse. She decided to tell the truth and see what happened. "I am a circuit court judge," she said quietly. The pen stopped moving in Sergeant Williams's hand. He looked up at her again, this time with shock and disbelief. "Did you just say you are a judge?" "Yes, Judge Rebecca Stone, 5th Judicial Circuit." Sergeant Williams set down his clipboard and stared at her for a long moment. Rebecca could see the wheels turning in his mind as he processed this information. She had presided over hundreds of cases that had originated from arrests made in this very building. Many of the officers who worked here had testified in her courtroom. "Judge Stone," he said slowly, "what in the world are you doing here?" Rebecca took a deep breath and began to explain what had happened on Highway 94. As she spoke, she watched Sergeant Williams's expression change from confusion to concern to outright alarm. When she finished her account, he was shaking his head in disbelief. "Judge, I need to make some phone calls." This is not good," but Rebecca held up a hand. "Sergeant Williams, I appreciate your concern, but I want to be processed just like any other person who gets brought in here. I do not want special treatment because of my position. What I want is for the system to work the way it is supposed to work." Sergeant Williams looked uncomfortable. "Judge, with all due respect, this situation is way above my pay grade. Maybe I should call the sheriff. The sheriff can be informed in the morning through normal channels. Right now, I just want to make my phone call and get through this night." Rebecca was led to a phone mounted on the W. All in a small room that reeked of disinfectant and fear. She dialed the number for her longtime friend and colleague, attorney Patricia Chen. Patricia had appeared before Rebecca's bench dozens of times over the years, and they had developed a professional relationship built on mutual respect and trust. The phone rang several times before a sleepy voice answered. "Hello? Patricia, it is Rebecca Stone. I am sorry to wake you, but I need your help." There was a pause as Patricia tried to process why a judge would be calling her at nearly midnight. "Rebecca, what is wrong? Are you okay?" "I am in jail, Patricia. I have been arrested and I need an attorney." The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long that Rebecca thought the call might have been disconnected. Finally, Patricia found her voice again. "You are where?" "Rebecca, what happened? Are you hurt?" Rebecca gave Patricia a brief summary of the night's events, trying to keep her emotions in check as she described being dragged through the mud and thrown into the patrol car. She could hear Patricia's sharp intake of breath when she described the officer's behavior. "My God, Rebecca. This is unbelievable. I will be down there in 30 minutes. Patricia, there is something else you should know. The officers who arrested me, I think they have cases on my docket. Officer Davis has a DUI case next week, and Officer Mitchell is testifying in a domestic violence case." "You have got to be kidding me," Patricia said. "This just keeps getting worse. Okay, do not say another word to anyone until I get there. Do you understand?" After hanging up the phone, Rebecca was led to a small holding cell where she would spend the rest of the night. The cell contained nothing but a concrete bench and a stainless steel toilet. The walls were covered with graffiti left by previous occupants, most of it obscene or desperate messages to the outside world. As she sat on the hard bench in her ruined clothes, Rebecca thought about all the defendants who had sat in this same spot over the years. She had seen them in her courtroom the next day, often looking defeated and disheveled after a night in jail. She had always tried to be understanding about their appearance, knowing that spending the night in custody was not easy for anyone, but now she truly understood what that experience felt like. The holding cell was cold, and her wet clothes made it even worse. She could not stop shivering, and every muscle in her body ached from being dragged through the ditch, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional impact of what had happened. She kept replaying the events in her mind, trying to understand how a simple car breakdown had escalated into such a nightmare. Rebecca had always believed in the justice system, despite its flaws. She had dedicated her career to ensuring that everyone who came before her court was treated fairly, regardless of their race, economic status, or social position. But tonight had shown her a side of that same system that she had only heard about in stories and complaints. At around 3 in the morning, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside her cell. Sergeant Williams appeared with Patricia Chen, who looked like she had thrown on clothes and rushed out of the house. Patricia's usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she was wearing jeans and a sweatshirt instead of her typical professional attire. "Oh my God, Rebecca," Patricia said when she saw her friend's condition. "Look what they did to you." Rebecca stood up from the bench, wincing as her stiff muscles protested the movement. "I have looked better," she said with a weak smile. Patricia turned to Sergeant Williams with fire in her eyes. "I want to see the arrest report, the booking photos, and any other documentation you have about this arrest. And I want to know which officers were involved." "Ma'am, I can get you the paperwork, but I need to tell you something else," Sergeant Williams said. "About an hour ago, we got a call from someone who says they have dashcam footage of the whole thing. Apparently, a motorist was driving by during the incident and recorded everything." Patricia and Rebecca exchanged glances. If there was video evidence of what had happened, it would change everything. The officer's version of events would be much harder to maintain if there was footage showing them dragging a cooperative citizen through a muddy ditch. "Who has this footage?" Patricia asked. "A truck driver named Bob Martinez. He is on his way here now with the memory card from his dash cam. Says he could not sleep after seeing what happened and wanted to make sure the truth came out." Rebecca felt a surge of hope for the first time since this ordeal began. She had always believed that the truth had a way of coming to light, and maybe this was proof of that belief. As they waited for the truck driver to arrive, Patricia filled Rebecca in on what she planned to do in the morning. "First, we are going to file complaints with the State Police Internal Affairs Division and the County Prosecutor's Office. Then we are going to contact the FBI Civil Rights Division. What these officers did to you was a federal crime, Rebecca." Rebecca nodded, but her mind was already moving ahead to the bigger picture. "Patricia, this cannot just be about getting justice for me. If they did this to a sitting judge, imagine what they do to people who do not have any power or connections. This has to be about changing the system." "One step at a time," Patricia replied. "First, we make sure these officers face consequences for what they did tonight. Then we can work on the bigger issues." As the sun began to rise outside the small window in the holding cell, Rebecca thought about Officers Davis and Mitchell. In just a few days, they would be walking into her courtroom expecting to testify in their cases. They had no idea that the muddy woman they had arrested was the same judge who would be sitting behind the bench. She wondered if they would recognize her when they saw her in her robes. She wondered if they would remember dragging her through that ditch when they were sworn in to tell the truth. Most of all, she wondered if they would finally understand that justice was not something you could abuse without consequences. The sound of footsteps in the corridor announced the arrival of Bob Martinez, the truck driver whose dashcam had captured everything. As Sergeant Williams went to meet him, Rebecca closed her eyes and said a silent prayer of gratitude. The truth was about to come out, and justice was about to be served. 1 week later, Judge Rebecca Stone sat in her chambers preparing for what would be one of the most significant days in her judicial career. The bruises on her wrists had faded to a yellowish purple, but they were still visible beneath the sleeves of her black robe. The story of her arrest had spread through the courthouse like wildfire, though she had requested that the media be kept out until after the pending cases were resolved. Patricia Chen had worked tirelessly over the past week, filing complaints with multiple agencies and coordinating with federal investigators who were now involved in the case. The dashcam footage from truck driver Bob Martinez had been turned over to authorities and clearly showed Officers Davis and Mitchell using excessive force against a cooperative citizen. The video had been reviewed by the county prosecutor, the State Police Internal Affairs Division, and FBI civil rights investigators. Rebecca checked her appearance in the mirror one final time. She had decided to preside over both officers' cases as originally scheduled, rather than immediately recusing herself. Her attorney had advised against it, but Rebecca felt it was important to demonstrate that the justice system could work properly even in extraordinary circumstances. She would follow the law exactly as it was written, regardless of her personal feelings about the defendants. At 9 o'clock sharp, Rebecca entered her courtroom for the first case of the day. Officer Davis was scheduled to testify in a DUI case, where his testimony was crucial to the prosecution's case. As she took her seat behind the bench, she could see Davis standing near the witness box, reviewing his notes with the prosecutor. All rise. The 5th Judicial Circuit Court is now in session. The Honorable Rebecca Stone presiding, announced the bailiff. Officer Davis looked up at the sound of her name being called. Rebecca watched as recognition slowly dawned on his face. The color drained from his cheeks as he realized that the judge sitting before him was the same woman he had dragged through a muddy ditch just 1 week ago. His mouth fell open slightly, and he gripped his notepad so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The prosecutor, District Attorney Kevin Thompson, noticed Davis's sudden change in demeanor. "Officer Davis, are you feeling all right? You look like you have seen a ghost." Davis could not take his eyes off Judge Stone. He stammered, I think I might be getting sick. Can we postpone this hearing?" Rebecca maintained perfect judicial composure as she addressed the courtroom. "Officer Davis, do you have a medical condition that prevents you from testifying today?" The sound of her voice seemed to snap Davis out of his shock. He looked around the courtroom as if searching for an escape route. The defense attorney, Linda Rodriguez, was watching the exchange with growing interest. She had heard rumors about Judge Stone's arrest but had not connected it to the officers in her case. "Your Honor," Davis said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I think there might be a conflict of interest in this case." District Attorney Thompson looked confused. "What kind of conflict, Officer Davis? You have testified in Judge Stone's courtroom dozens of times before." Rebecca leaned forward slightly. "Officer Davis, are you suggesting that this court cannot fairly hear your testimony? If so, you will need to be more specific about the nature of this alleged conflict." The courtroom was dead silent as Davis struggled to find words. He knew that explaining the conflict would mean admitting to what he had done, but he also knew that proceeding with his testimony would be impossible under the circumstances. "Your Honor," he finally managed, "I believe you and I have had a recent interaction outside of this courtroom that might affect these proceedings." Defense Attorney Rodriguez immediately stood up. "Your Honor, I request a sidebar to discuss this matter." Rebecca nodded. "Counsel, please approach the bench." At the sidebar conference, Rebecca spoke in low tones that could not be heard by the rest of the courtroom. "Ms. Rodriguez, Mr. Thompson, Officer Davis is correct that we have had a recent interaction. Last Tuesday night, he and his partner arrested me during what should have been a routine traffic assistance stop. I am the victim in a pending federal civil rights investigation involving Officer Davis." District Attorney Thompson's face went pale. "Judge Stone, are you saying that Officer Davis arrested you?" "That is correct. He and Officer Mitchell detained me unlawfully, used excessive force, and charged me with crimes I did not commit. All charges against me have since been dropped, and both officers are under federal investigation. Defense attorney Rodriguez could barely contain her excitement. Your Honor, this completely destroys the credibility of the prosecution's key witness. I move for immediate dismissal of all charges against my client. Rebecca considered the request carefully. Ms. Rodriguez, while Officer Davis's conduct toward me was reprehensible, I cannot dismiss charges against your client based solely on that. However, I will allow you to fully cross-examine Officer Davis about his recent actions, as they directly relate to his credibility as a witness. They returned to their positions and Rebecca addressed the courtroom. Due to matters that have come to light regarding Officer Davis's recent conduct, this court will allow expanded cross-examination regarding his fitness as a witness. Officer Davis, you are reminded that you are under oath and that perjury is a felony. What followed was one of the most uncomfortable exchanges ever witnessed in that courtroom. Defense attorney Rodriguez methodically walked Officer Davis through the events of the previous Tuesday night. With each question, Davis became more uncomfortable and his answers more evasive. Officer Davis, did you arrest Judge Stone last Tuesday night? Yes, ma'am. And what crime had Judge Stone committed when you arrested her? She was being uncooperative during our investigation. What were you investigating, Officer Davis? We had reports of stolen vehicles in the area. Did you find any evidence that Judge Stone's vehicle was stolen? No, ma'am. Did you verify that Judge Stone was the legal owner of the vehicle? Yes, ma'am. So you arrested a citizen who had committed no crime, who owned the vehicle she was driving and who was simply experiencing car trouble. Objection, called District Attorney Thompson, though his heart clearly was not in it. Overruled, Rebecca said calmly. The witness will answer. She was resisting our lawful commands, Davis said weakly. Officer Davis, what lawful purpose did you have for ordering Judge Stone out of her vehicle? Davis had no good answer for this question, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. His credibility was completely destroyed, and the prosecution's case fell apart before their eyes. After Officer Davis's testimony concluded, District Attorney Thompson requested a recess to consider his options. Rebecca granted the request and returned to her chambers, knowing that the case against the DUI defendant would likely be dismissed due to lack of credible evidence. The second case of the day involved Officer Mitchell, who was scheduled to testify in a domestic violence case. When court reconvened at 2 o'clock, Mitchell was visibly nervous as he entered the courtroom. Unlike his partner, Mitchell recognized Judge Stone immediately when she took the bench. Your Honor, Mitchell said before anyone else could speak, I need to request that this court appoint counsel for me before I testify. This request sent shockwaves through the courtroom. A police officer asking for an attorney before testifying was almost unprecedented, and suggested that Mitchell believed his testimony might incriminate him in some way. Officer Mitchell, Rebecca said, are you invoking your Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination? Yes, Your Honor. I believe my testimony in this case might be used against me in other proceedings. The defense attorney in the domestic violence case immediately moved for dismissal, arguing that without Mitchell's testimony, the prosecution could not prove their case. District Attorney Thompson found himself in the impossible position of having both of his key witnesses from the Stone arrest invoke their rights or lose all credibility in a single day. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that both cases would have to be dismissed or significantly reduced due to the compromised credibility of the officers involved. Rebecca handled each decision with the same careful attention to the law that had marked her entire career. But she could not help feeling a sense of justice being served. When the court day ended, Rebecca remained in her chambers for a long time, reflecting on what had transpired. 2 cases had been derailed not because she had sought revenge, but because the officers' own actions had destroyed their credibility as witnesses. The justice system had worked exactly as it was supposed to work. Patricia Chen knocked on her door as the courthouse was closing. How do you feel? She asked her friend. Rebecca looked out the window at the parking lot where she could see Officers Davis and Mitchell walking to their patrol cars, probably wondering if they still had jobs to go to tomorrow. I feel like justice was served today, Rebecca replied. Not the kind of justice they were expecting when they walked into my courtroom, but the kind of justice the system was designed to provide. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the federal investigation continued and the media attention intensified. But today had proven that even when the system failed, it could still find a way to correct itself. And sometimes, Rebecca thought, that was all you could ask for. 3 months after that fateful night on Highway 94, the consequences of Officers Davis and Mitchell's actions had rippled far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The dashcam footage from truck driver Bob Martinez had been released to the public after the federal investigation concluded, and it had sparked national outrage. The video clearly showed 2 police officers dragging a cooperative citizen through a muddy ditch for no apparent reason, other than her refusal to be intimidated. Judge Rebecca Stone sat in her office on a sunny Thursday morning, reviewing a stack of letters from across the country. People from all walks of life had written to express their support and to share their own stories of police misconduct. Many of the letters came from other judges, attorneys, and law enforcement officers who were appalled by what their colleagues had done. Patricia Chen knocked on her door and entered with a cup of coffee and the morning newspaper. "You made the front page again," she said, placing the paper on Rebecca's desk. The headline read, "Former Officers Davis and Mitchell sentenced to federal prison." Article detailed how both men had been convicted of violating Rebecca's civil rights under federal law. Officer Davis received 18 months in prison while Officer Mitchell got 15 months. Both had also been fired from their positions with the state police and would never be able to work in law enforcement again. "How do you feel about the sentences?" Patricia asked, settling into the chair across from Rebecca's desk. Rebecca folded the newspaper and set it aside. "I feel like justice was served, but I also feel sad about how unnecessary all of this was. These men destroyed their own careers and hurt their families because they could not treat a citizen with basic respect and dignity." The federal case had been straightforward once the video evidence was reviewed. The FBI Civil Rights Division had determined that both officers had violated Rebecca's 4th and 14th Amendment rights by detaining her without cause and using excessive force. The case had been prosecuted by a team of federal attorneys who had painted a clear picture of 2 officers who had let their biases and authority go unchecked. During the trial, several other victims had come forward with similar stories about encounters with Davis and Mitchell. The pattern of behavior suggested that what happened to Rebecca was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader problem with these particular officers. The federal prosecutors had used these additional cases to demonstrate a pattern of civil rights violations. Rebecca stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the courthouse parking lot where she had been arrested just a few months earlier. "Patricia, I keep thinking about all the people who went through similar experiences but did not have the resources or position to fight back. How many others were dragged through ditches and thrown in jail and nobody cared because they were not a judge?" This question had been haunting Rebecca since her arrest. She had used her platform to speak out about police accountability and the need for reform, but she knew that her voice carried weight only because of her position. Regular citizens who experienced the same treatment often found themselves dismissed or ignored. "That is why what you are doing matters so much, Patricia," Isha replied. "The police reform legislation you helped draft is going to make a real difference." Rebecca had indeed worked with state legislators to develop new laws requiring body cameras for all state police officers, mandatory de-escalation training, and independent oversight of police misconduct investigations. The legislation, known as the Rebecca Stone Act, had passed both houses of the state legislature and was awaiting the governor's signature. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Rebecca's secretary entered with a concerned expression. "Judge Stone, there are some people here to see you. They say they are family members of Officers Davis and Mitchell." Rebecca and Patricia exchanged glances. They had not expected this development. "Show them in," Rebecca said after a moment's consideration. 3 people entered the office: an older woman who appeared to be in her 60s, a younger woman with a small child, and a teenage boy. The older woman stepped forward nervously. "Judge Stone, my name is Dorothy Davis. I am Officer Davis's mother. This is his wife Jennifer and their son Michael." She gestured to the other visitors. "We wanted to come here and apologize for what my son did to you." Rebecca was taken aback by this unexpected visit. She gestured for them to sit down. "Mrs. Davis, you do not need to apologize for your son's actions. He is an adult who made his own choices." Jennifer Davis, who had been silent until now, spoke up with tears in her eyes. "Judge Stone, I know what Billy did was wrong. There is no excuse for it. But he is still my husband and the father of my children. His going to prison is going to destroy our family financially. The teenage boy, Michael, looked up at Rebecca with a mixture of shame and defiance. My dad is not a bad person. He just made a mistake. Rebecca felt her heart go out to this family, especially the children who were paying the price for their father's poor decisions. She had wrestled with these conflicting emotions throughout the entire legal process. While she believed strongly in accountability, she also understood that the consequences extended far beyond just the officers themselves. Michael, Rebecca said gently, you are right that your father is not a bad person. But what he did to me was not just a mistake. It was a choice to treat another human being with cruelty and disrespect. That choice has consequences, and those consequences are meant to teach others that such behavior will not be tolerated. Dorothy Davis wiped her eyes with a tissue. Judge Stone, I raised my son to respect all people regardless of their color or background. I do not know where I went wrong. Mrs. Davis, this is not about how you raised your son. This is about choices he made as an adult police officer. The badge comes with great responsibility, and when that responsibility is abused, there must be accountability. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with Rebecca trying to balance compassion for the families with the need to maintain that justice had been appropriately served. When they left, she felt emotionally drained but also more convinced than ever that the system had worked as it should. Later that afternoon, Rebecca received a call from the governor's office. Governor Thompson wanted to meet with her about the police reform legislation and discuss her potential appointment to the state Supreme Court. The events of the past few months had raised her profile significantly, and she was being considered for higher judicial positions. I am honored by the consideration, Rebecca told the governor's chief of staff. But my focus right now is on making sure the reforms we have proposed actually get implemented correctly. Over the next several weeks, Rebecca found herself in an unusual position. She had become a national symbol for police accountability, but she had never sought that role. Speaking requests came in from law schools, civil rights organizations, and police training academies across the country. She accepted some of them, always focusing on the message that the justice system could work when people were willing to hold everyone accountable to the same standards. One of the most meaningful invitations came from the State Police Academy, where she was asked to speak to new recruits about constitutional rights and proper police procedures. Standing before a class of young officers who were just beginning their careers, Rebecca felt a sense of hope that future interactions between police and citizens might be different. The badge you will soon wear represents the highest ideals of our society, she told the recruits. It gives you the authority to enforce the law, but it also requires you to be the guardians of everyone's constitutional rights. When you forget that responsibility, you not only hurt the people you swear to serve, you also betray every good officer who wears the uniform with honor. After her speech, a young African-American recruit approached her. Judge Stone, thank you for what you did. My community has experienced a lot of problems with police, and knowing that someone in your position was willing to fight for accountability gives us hope that things can change. As Rebecca drove home that evening, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that rainy night when her car broke down on Highway 94. She had always believed in the justice system, but now she had experienced it from both sides. She had seen how it could fail spectacularly, but also how it could ultimately correct itself when people refused to accept injustice. The case was officially closed, but Rebecca knew that the real work was just beginning. Changing hearts and minds, reforming institutions, and ensuring that what happened to her would not happen to others, that would take years of sustained effort. But as she pulled into her driveway and saw her husband waiting for her with a warm smile, she felt ready for that challenge. Officers Davis and Mitchell were serving their sentences in federal prison, their law enforcement careers over forever. Their families were struggling to rebuild their lives. The victims who had suffered similar treatment were finally seeing some measure of justice. The system had held everyone accountable, just as it was supposed to do, and Judge Rebecca Stone returned to her courtroom each day, continuing to serve justice with the same fairness and integrity she had always shown, but now with a deeper understanding of how precious and fragile that justice could be. The muddy ditch where she had been dragged had become, in her words, the place where injustice met its match. Not through revenge, but through the very legal system those officers thought they could abuse with impunity. Justice, As it turned out, really was blind, but it was not powerless. And sometimes, Rebecca thought as she put on her robes each morning, that made all the difference in the world.